So the vigil in the garden, our text for this morning, is crucial to how we navigate the difficult terrain of empire, and it lies at the heart of apocalyptic faith. What I say to you, I say to all, stay awake. This is an imperative that concludes Jesus' apocalyptic discourse in Mark 13. For the church, history is long and hard and lonely. The very last of Jesus' parables in Mark's story recognizes this. We have been placed in service of the vision of a house for all peoples. But it's not easy trying to maintain this against the storms of progress. It often feels as if the architect of the house has simply gone away and left us to our own devices. We don't have answers for all the world's questions. We don't know when or how or if the architect will return and put an end to the suffering. All we have been told is to keep vigil at the door with the angel of history, to stay awake with Jesus. For us, the world has become Gethsemane. This isn't an invitation to insomniac theology and politics. And I don't use this metaphor lightly because I am someone who suffers from a taxing complex of sleep disorders, so it's not a throwaway line. I understand what it's like not to sleep. It's tough. I understand that the notion of keeping vigil is strange and difficult for progressive activists. It could be construed as yet another religious rationalization for doing nothing to try to change anything, to abandon the struggle within history for some blessed hope that will rescue us from history. But that's not what insomniac theology is about. On March 31st, 1968, Passion Sunday, less than a week before he was assassinated in Memphis, Martin Luther King preached at the National Cathedral in Washington, D.C. He was campaigning for his proposed Poor People's Campaign, while at the same time he had been drawn deeply into the struggle of low-income workers in Memphis. His sermon was titled, "Remaining Awake Through a Great Revolution." And his text was, apocalyptically enough, from the book of Revelation. "Behold, I make all things new." In this sermon, King reiterated a theme he had been hammering on for a year, the need to build common cause against the three great pathologies of American empire: racism, militarism, and poverty. It is an unhappy truth that racism is a way of life for the vast majority of white Americans, King said, spoken and unspoken, acknowledged and denied, subtle and not so subtle. It permeates and poisons the whole body politic. He added, "We're challenged to rid our nation and world of poverty, but like a monstrous octopus, it keeps spreading its tentacles into hamlets and villages all over the world." And finally, he said, "We've got to put our bodies and souls in motion. The challenge we face is also to find an alternative to war and bloodshed." And he went on to denounce the war in Indochina as the most unjust war in history. King had forged the outline of this critique a year earlier in his famous Beyond Vietnam speech. He called them the giant triplets: racism, militarism, and poverty. We might call them the three horsemen of the apocalypse. Despite the opposition of most of his colleagues in the civil rights establishment, King chose that moment to articulate his open and unequivocal opposition to the Vietnam War, and articulated a bold and prescient prophetic critique of the inevitable relationship between war and empire, an analysis which resonates still. He gave this speech exactly 1 year, almost to the hour, before he was murdered in Memphis, victim of a government conspiracy to silence the voice of our greatest prophet. In light of all of this, his Remaining Awake sermon suggests that true apocalyptic faith holds nonviolent vigil amidst the storms of imperial history, not passively, but actively. King remained awake to the persistent realities of racism, to the Indochina War, and to the widespread economic disparity at home and abroad. At the same time, he remained awake to God's dream of beloved community, of true justice. And he did so at a time where he could just as easily has taken his Nobel Peace Prize and his modest civil rights gains and settled for one of the many academic or board positions that had been offered to him. Take his awards and go home. Instead, however, he pressed his campaign against the giant triplets. He describes in his Remaining Awake sermon the crossroads of conscience. He talks about how people said, Dr. King, don't you think you got to take it easy now? You can't oppose the war. You can't be against the administration. It's going to hurt the budget of your organization. People who once respected you in the administration might lose their respect. Don't you feel you really got to change? And he looked at the reporter and said, problem is, I don't determine what is right and wrong by looking at the budget of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Ultimately, a leader is not a searcher but a molder of consensus, and there comes a time when one must take a position that is neither safe nor politic nor popular, but do it because conscience tells them it is right. And I believe today the need is for people of goodwill to come and say, in the words of the old Negro spiritual, we ain't going to study war no more.